Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning. My name is Ed Heisler. I'm the Executive Director of Men as Peacemakers. And as Vicki said, I really appreciate being invited by this group to come speak today. I've been battling a cold for the majority of the week, and this is the first day that my voice has started to go. So we're going to see how that goes. Hopefully I can keep it going for you all here today. How many of you are familiar with Men as Peacemakers as an organization? Wow, that's really good. Great, thank you, everybody. I've been with Men as Peacemakers for about 4 years now. A little bit over 2 of those I've been the executive director. And Men as Peacemakers is a really unique organization in the community because it has almost an 18-year history now of directly involving men with women in the community in promoting nonviolence and preventing harm, creating a more equitable community. And we've done that over the 18 years in different ways. The organization has always been kind of set up to respond directly to community need, and then we develop the programming that is needed and try to find a way to fund it, that kind of thing, and we've been doing that for 18 years now. I am going to spend just a brief period of time here explaining a little bit of what we do now, because Vicki thought that would be a good framing to explain how we're connected to this work related to preventing and ending sex trafficking. So first of all, just in the broader scale, one of our funders is the Office of Justice Programs. And some of the data that they released recently suggested that 60% of youth in the state of Minnesota are they're witnessing being around some form of violence in the course of any given year. And then kind of surprisingly, 50% of youth in the state are directly experiencing, they are being victimized by at least one act of violence on an annual basis. So that's an environment that has a lot of violence in it for our youth. If we focus on the sort of violence that created Men as Peacemakers, which was largely violence against women, the University of Minnesota, along with the Women's Foundation, have done studies and research every 2 years that has consistently found that 1 in every 3 women in Minnesota will experience sexual and domestic violence. They're separate statistics. 1 in 3 will experience sexual violence, 1 in 3 will experience domestic violence, and then there's obviously some crossover in that, right? And so that's a huge number. If we think about every 1, 2, 3 women that we know experiencing that violence at some point in their lives. And I myself had kind of an experience when I first got into work related to violence against women of hearing those statistics, looking at CDC labels on the back or the federal government Office of Violence Against Women, and thinking, well, those look like credible sources, but I don't know that many women who have experienced that kind of thing. And the one thing that I'll say about that statistic is that as soon as you start really getting involved in work that's related to sexual or domestic violence or violence against women, out of the woodwork come the women in your life that you didn't know had any of those experiences. I remember saying at my first interview for a job that I didn't know anybody who had experienced domestic violence, and 2 months later I was getting friends and family members who were coming forward to me, women in my life, saying, I'm so glad that you're doing that because my daughter's going through this right now, or I can remember being in high school and having a boyfriend who wouldn't let me break up with him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of violence that's out there in our community. And a part of the thing that we want to focus on is how do you create an environment that prevents that harm from happening in the first place. And one of the things that we really know and believe is that children, if we think about the little ones in our lives, are not born inherently to be violent and controlling and dominating, things like this. And so we believe that the human potential of people is tremendous, and we're focused on coming together in ways that help create an environment that's going to give all of the youth, all of the people in our community, the best chance at thriving and creating a community environment that is good for everyone. And that involves the leadership and the involvement of men directly as well. Now, we don't just pop up related to community need. We don't hear community needs and just throw programming out there willy-nilly. We think strategically about how we do this. This is a tool. One of our other funders is the Department of Health. And this is a tool called the Spectrum of Prevention, which is a public health tool. And generally, this is the tool that we use in all of our work as we're thinking about the impact that we want to make. We take a look at what the presenting problem is, and of course there's always a whole lot of educating that you have to do around any sort of issue that affects public health. But we're also looking at the upper levels of this spectrum of prevention. How do you embed these changes? How do you embed interventions? How do you embed what you want to create in the community directly into the policies, into the institutional fabric of any given, for any given solution that you have? And so that's the way that we like to think. And of course, for those of you who are familiar with public health, you'll recognize from everything from anti-smoking to child safety seats, the sort of strategy that looks at everything from educating to impacting policy and in organizational practices. But we do that in a way that addresses school environments, workplace environments, campus environments, athletic environments, things like that. So I'm going to run through a couple of the programs that we're running at Men as Peacemakers right now. We have about 8 staff there. The organization has grown over the years. This program is called the Boys Restorative Program. There was a need, there wasn't any specific programming aside from Boy Scouts for boys in the school environment. We're talking about 3rd through 6th grade boys right now. And there were a lot of boys who were struggling to succeed socially, to succeed academically. And we knew that that is a key time when you look at development, where boys are getting a sense of who they are, starting to get a sense of what it means to be a man, a lot of beliefs around who girls and women are, that kind of thing. And so we have programming in multiple elementary schools around the community that grabs boys who are referred because they're struggling in some way, shape, or form. We bring in men from the community who volunteer weekly with these boys. We run all sorts of activities. We help them achieve better in their schooling. We work on socializing and connecting them with other boys and girls. And then they get opportunities to take leadership on issues around equality and bullying and things like that. So it's been a great program. This is a project called the Girls Restorative Program. It's like the counterpart to the boys program. But the need that was presented for girls was 8th through 12th grade. In fact, it started out being 9th through 12th grade. And then the girls said we really could have used this in the transition from middle school to high school. So we started to have girls from high school lead groups with 8th grade girls. And what this program does, girls again are referred. Oftentimes they are not expected to graduate. They're on truancy lists, things like this. They also, about 50% of them are experiencing some form of violence against women already. We've had girls who are experiencing all sorts of harm. You can run down any list that we could come up with, and it's what the girls are facing in this group. And what we do is we create weekly group settings for them. They connect with other girls from different racial and cultural backgrounds. They go on a ton of field trips together. You can see some of the fun stuff that they're doing. And they take leadership on different issues in the community. Some of you may have saw last year at the Girls Restorative Program in January, wrote an editorial on sex trafficking and how it impacts young girls. That was one thing that they did. This year they're doing programming, mandatory programming for 8th and 11th grade students. They're leading it in the schools in Two Harbors and Silver Bay around healthy relationships. So they get a lot of opportunities to take leadership, and we've seen double-digit increases in graduation rates compared to state average, and that includes girls of colors, Native American and African American students. So that's been a real big benefit. We have a program called the Champions Initiative that focuses specifically on using athletics as a mechanism to prevent violence against women and promote the healthy development of youth. This came into play in about 2010. You may remember Kay Sisto was murdered on the west side of Duluth in a murder-suicide by her husband, and her teenage boys were left to find her. And we had a group of about 35 community men who came together and started to talk about the potential that athletics has to build the beliefs and the values that would help prevent that sort of violence from happening in the future, because there are so many youth that interact with athletics, and coaches have such an incredible platform to shape the beliefs and the values of young people. And then we also have restorative justice programming. This is a picture of a program for adjudicated youth. Oftentimes if they get a ticket for anything from shoplifting to some form of violence, They will first get a diversionary chance. They get to go through our program and their ticket gets ripped up. If they are in more serious trouble, then they might end up getting sentenced to one of our longer restorative justice programs. But the whole goal is to help them understand what it is, the harm that they caused, why they did what they did, and then to look at ways that they can make amends to the community, to the victim if appropriate, and change their behavior moving forward. And we have another program that is related to the domestic violence offenders in our community who have not responded to other interventions. So they're some of the higher risk domestic violence offenders. And it's a more intensive, accountability-based, victim-based approach to dealing with them, oftentimes lasting over 8 months of weekly circles with domestic violence offenders. And then finally, a lot of people don't realize that Men as Peacemakers has all this stuff going on. Finally, we have a program called the Minnesota Men's Action Network. And that is a statewide national technical assistance program that works with other communities to help them set up efforts to engage men in the prevention of domestic and sexual violence. There's a picture of me working with a bunch of fraternity members a couple of, that was a few months ago. They were called the Campus Reds, and it was a great time. So that gives you a run through of the normal programs that Men as Peacemakers is running at any given time. We are also usually having about 3 additional programs that are running without any actual funding that we're developing because of the need that's been suggested, and we're trying to find legs for those programs. And trafficking is one of those needs that has come forward. It was about 2 years ago, I think, when PAVSA in the American Indian Community Housing Organization started to talk with Men as Peacemakers and say, we'd like you to work on getting men involved in preventing sex trafficking in this community. And that's a big job, right? Sex trafficking, we're learning, is a very big issue. And so since that time, we've been kind of laying a framework, trying to develop a path to do some sustainable work on ending sex trafficking and engaging men in that work. And it's one of the projects that we've been putting a lot of effort into recently. So I'm going to spend some time today talking about sex trafficking. As you can see, there's a fairly technical description of what sex trafficking is: sexual exploitation through solicitation, inducement, and the promotion of prostitution. And one of the things that we really want people to remember is that sex trafficking is violence against women. Spoken very plainly, it's a form of violence against women. And indeed, when we're talking about sex trafficking, we don't want to be mincing words here. What we are talking about is sex trafficking being the same as prostitution. And you can see this this quote from a study that came out in 2001 that says, in prostitution, the conditions which make genuine consent possible are absent: physical safety, equal power with customers, and real alternatives. And so what we're saying is that we know that there's different ways in which women and children are prostituted and in which sex trafficking happens, but there is no form of it in which that level of consent can be reached. And that in fact, if we want to get real plain about the language, when people are buying or selling women and children for their profit or their pleasure, that consists of a paid rape. And so that really is the sort of thinking that we're trying to get out there, because when we're talking about prostitution and sex trafficking, they're issues that have been so normalized that we have a whole canon of jokes about it. We have ways of talking about how normal it is, right? But in reality, you've got an issue here where you cannot have a consensual and safe and protected relationship between the purchaser and the person who's being purchased. Now, one thing that we know is that over and over, studies show that the vast majority of the purchasers of women and children who are prostituted are men. If you look at a recent Chicago study that came out, they found that if you want to look at what the most common sort of John is going to look like, person who buys, it would be a white, sort of middle-aged man who's in a relationship and makes over $40,000. Now, of course, men across the spectrum are buying and selling women and children, but this is something that, by and large, the demand is being created by men, and that's part of the reason why Men as Peacemakers sees it as so important that men are a part of the solution to this problem, because there are a lot of men who aren't participating directly in this. If you look at that sheet that I handed out, the data that was on that sheet, it goes over some of the data that's been collected over the past 10 years or so. And one of the things that we just want to really highlight as you look down that sheet, and it's included in these statistics too, is that sex trafficking is not something that works out very well for the people who are trafficked. The vast majority of women who are entering into studies around trafficking say that they want to get out, they don't know where to turn. In every study, you're finding incredibly high rates of violence that are being experienced by the women who are trafficked or prostituted. Again, the vast majority of the purchasers are men. Racism is very inherent in trafficking. This is a study that largely was done here called the Garden of Truth. And when they were doing those interviews, one thing that they found is that the way in which both the pimps and the johns were playing off racial stereotypes was a huge way of kind of marketing the women who were involved. So there's a lot of harm that's happened. Even this last bullet here is talking about 79% sexually assaulted, 92 had been raped, 84% were physically assaulted in prostitution, and 72% had suffered traumatic brain injuries from violence while they were in prostitution. So this isn't really a moral debate around sexuality. In fact, from Men as Peacemakers perspective, we're very pro-sexuality, expressions of sexuality, et cetera, et cetera. This is about violence against women by economically creating a system of buying and selling women and children for the profit and pleasure of others. And that's what we want to focus on undoing, and men are really key to that. And one of the questions that this is going to pose to us as a community is, do we care about all women's lives? And I believe that this is a group that probably thinks about this more than a lot of other groups of people because of the focus that you kind of have on critical thinking and such. But one of the things that I hear the most often is people saying, well, I don't see sex trafficking. I don't see that happening in my neighborhood. Even when I go home to the place where I come from, you know, what I can expect nowadays is conversations with my family, sometimes with my group of friends, saying, okay, so there's this focus on this issue. You say that in Duluth, they did a point-in-time survey, a couple of opportunities to come and self-report as a sex trafficking victim. 63 women showed up, but we don't see this. We don't see this happening outside our door. And a part of the reason for that is that folks who are trafficking women and children are looking for vulnerability, right? And so it may very well be that if you live in a place where there's economic security, where there's less vulnerability, that you're not seeing people disappear right outside your back door like you would in other neighborhoods that are closely connected to this city. And so it's one of these questions that particularly for white people is important to understand, that the vast majority of women and children that are being trafficked in this community are women and children of color, and then poor white women, right? And so in order for us to kind of be able to open up and see that and then deal with it, we have to really make a commitment that all people in this community have equal value and dignity, and that we're going to approach this issue from that perspective. Because largely this has been set up to serve a certain portion of the community, and there are folks who are being trafficked from other portions of the community. Oops. So I already mentioned that men have a unique opportunity and responsibility to end sex trafficking because of the way in which men are connected to demand, but also just because men hold key positions in leadership in a community as well. And this is a huge opportunity to address a problem that exists right here in the Twin Ports. And so one of the things that Men as Peacemakers did, and some of you may have attended this, was we held a forum back in October with support from Keith Ellison and Rick Nolan's offices to start a conversation with men about what we could do to end the demand for sex trafficking. There were about 135 people that showed up for that forum. Probably about 80% of them were men. It was a pretty big event. And from that, there was a group of about 20 men who continued and created a group called Men Against Sex Trafficking. They got the tagline, "Amending the Harm, Ending the Demand." And you can see their mission here. Men Against Sex Trafficking is a group dedicated to ending sex trafficking in the Twin Ports area We are men who work side by side with women in mending the harm caused by trafficking, and engaging the community in preventing ongoing sexual exploitation of women and children. So that group is very much in its infancy. There's information about it over here on the table. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more before we're done. But that is a group who is very much looking at creative ways in which we start addressing the demand for buying and selling women and children. And for any of you, it's not only for men. We just know that if we directly ask for men, then men show up. But for any of you who are interested in being involved in that, I encourage you to take a look at the sign-up sheet and sign up. So I'm going to take a little bit of time now to just talk about what creates the conditions where there is so much demand. We're going to look beneath the surface a little bit and start asking the question of how is it that the sweet girls, largely, boys and girls both are trafficked, but the vast majority of the victims are girls. How is it that these sweet girls are growing up into an environment where they're going to be leveraged for their bodies and for the pleasure that it can bring other people? They're going to be bought and sold for the profit and pleasure of others. Where this is one of the common sort of jokes, if you do a search on Google Images, it's one of the first things that you'll see. Lap dance, just one of life's little pleasures. Where when you go to a Twins game downtown in Minneapolis, and you get off the bus with your small children to go to America's greatest pastime, what you see is a huge billboard that looks like that, exotic showgirl dancers, free admission with same-day sporting event tickets, and they're handing out cards and things like that to dad as you're walking by on the way to your baseball game. And where you drive down the freeway and you see, Clear Channel advertising internet by playing on prostitution jokes, right? I had mentioned how normalized this idea of prostituting women and children is in our communities, right? So our little girls, and we know at the average age that girls are entering into prostitution is 12 to 14. Our little girls are growing up into an environment that normalizes and supports that, right? So we really do need to focus on what is going on in our community environment that's supporting this harm. And on the other side, how many have a little boy in your life that's about this size, right? I got one. They toddle around. Everything that they discover is a new adventure, right? They like making new friends. They give hugs. They do all this sort of stuff. One of the things that we want to focus on is this question of there's so much demand for the buying and selling of women and children. And certainly the vast majority of men aren't participating directly in trafficking. But what is going on that there is such a demand? Because we know that these little boys, they aren't born in such a way where they automatically see the value of women as coming through that sort of buying and selling sort of model, being able to do whatever you want to somebody that you purchase. So what's going on in our community, if they're not naturally getting that way, what's going on that supports that transition for some men? And one of the things that I'd like you to think about is that when I was a youngster, when I was in 8th grade, I was a really successful wrestler. And I remember I started to wrestle with the varsity team. And when my teammates, the older kids, found out that I hadn't had sex when I was in 8th grade, it became kind of their sole mission to figure out how to get me laid. Right? And that's a pretty common story, right? And so we'd be losing weight, we'd be jogging around, and they'd be giving me all these tips, some of which were kind of manipulative, like, you got to tell her that it's about time, you've been dating for 2 months, start putting pressure on her, tell her that you're going to dump her if she doesn't start to put out, that kind of stuff. Some of it was bordering on criminal, which thankfully I wasn't able to carry through, but bring her to a party, get a few drinks in her. Once she gets some drinks in her, she's going to loosen up. And then once you do it the first time, it'll be a lot easier. That's part of my experience, and I can remember hearing them tell me about a house that they were going to where you could pay to have sex. And one of them made this joke, and he said, if you can't get any in a relationship, he said, you can always just go pay for it, right? I remember kind of thinking, yeah, I guess that's true, right? So this is a reality for young people growing up. I'd like you to think about me or a little boy that you know now who's growing up, and now he's going to be about 16 years old, sitting in his room at his parents' house. We're just going to do a brief bit of guided imagery here. I want you to think about him in his bed. He's going to wake up to go to a sports practice in the morning, maybe a football practice. And he set his phone to wake him up to his favorite song. So I want you to think about him coming to consciousness and think about what the lyrics of that song are telling him about the value of men and women and what a relationship looks like and what sexuality looks like between men and women. You could use it as example, a song called Blurred Lines by Robin Thicke, which is the top song of the summer, which is basically a song that's about blurring the lines between a consensual and a non-consensual sexual relationship. And imagine him coming to consciousness, listening to those words which he's probably got memorized, right? And then his eyes are going to open. And think about the posters in his room. And what do the posters tell him about the value of women, the ones that have women on them? What do the posters tell him about the value of men? Maybe he's got some athletic posters, things like that, hanging on his wall. And then he gets out of his bed, and he pulls up his jeans, and he's got these $100 jeans that he bought. And I'd like you to think about the teams of adults who developed and designed advertising campaigns for those jeans. And then what those advertising campaigns look like as they relate to teaching him about the value of men and women and what relationships look like and what sexuality looks like in heterosexual relationships. And then as he goes downstairs, maybe he reads a newspaper, or maybe he's a little more modern, he's on his computer or something, you know. But there's headlines. Who holds power in the world? Who's making decisions? How does he see men and women portrayed? He goes to his football practice early in the morning there, and when they make a mistake, I was also a pretty successful football player. Maybe he's like on the offensive line. If he makes a mistake, the coach maybe says, "Hey ladies, I want you to pull up your panties and get going," right? Calling them names, calling them girl, granny, sissy, Mary, pussy, things like that. Sometimes in order to talk about this violence that exists, we have to use the language of the violence. So he's getting those messages from his coaches, and I just want to point out that what I did is I talked about the first 2 hours of his morning, right? I haven't talked about his whole day. We haven't talked about interactions with his teammates, his classmates. We haven't talked about what sort of movies he watches, video games, what state of relationship his parents have, that kind of stuff. We haven't gone there yet, right? We've just looked at 2 hours in the morning in the environment that's surrounding this little boy, who's not so little at age 16, granted. And so if we were to continue, one thing that we'd find is that there'd be some themes that would emerge. And one of the themes that we'd find in our current environment, if we were to take a look at what our boys and girls are growing up in, is that the value of women comes from their bodies. And in this little guided exercise that we did, we could this could have been one of the posters that would have been on this young man's wall, because this is a promotional poster from Sports Illustrated, swimsuit edition. And to most people, that's a pretty benign, it's not a very troubling sort of publication. But a key point here is that these women are going to be in the Olympics here in a couple of days. They're at the very, very top of their sport, right? The very top of their sport in the entire world. And the time when they get the most promotion, the most publicity, is when they're stripped down and their value is coming from their bodies. And so the problem when we have a belief system or a set of values that says that for the most part women's value comes from their bodies is that it's very limiting, of course, right? It limits women from their full human dignity. It limits the potential of women in our communities. It's very problematic, and the relationship between our society and women becomes far more objectified. And so we can see here a bunch of examples of advertisements, common advertisements that objectify women. One of the things that's becoming more and more common is to sexualize parts of women's bodies and then portray them as objects in a sexy way in order to sell product. But the thing that really concerns me about this, actually, is that if we go back to the 16-year-old boy, there's this thing where if we're giving a message that the value of women comes from their bodies, and that the value of women comes from their bodies, and then we're surprised when the first relationships that 16-year-old boys have tends to be a pretty objectifying relationship where they seem to treat women like their value only comes from the pleasure or the good looks that they bring to the relationship. It's very problematic when we're surprised about that, because it's not a hard message for a young boy to pick up, that the value of women comes from their bodies, and that it's very common for them to be treated as objects. And then you take it a few steps further, and I'm not saying that this is the values that everybody carries, but as a society, it's very common to hear or get messages that says that the value of a man is determined by how much sex you have. And then this concept that men should control women, and independent women oftentimes draw a lot of hostility. And these things all draw together. Now again, this is painting an environment in broad strokes. I'm not saying that everybody adheres specifically to these beliefs. But what I am saying is that when we create a sort of environment that really does focus on the value of women coming from their bodies, objectified relationships, it makes sense that men start behaving in ways where they control and dominate women in order to have more access to women's bodies. Because that's the sort of value that's been set up. And if you think about it in an economic sense, that's the way that women's bodies are being marketed and sold. And this extends into to pornography as well. And this will be my last sort of example of this. But pornography, I grew up from the generation where when I was in 6th grade, internet started to come into our houses, right? And so I can remember that it took about 4 days before my first buddy kind of discovered that you could find pornographic stuff on the internet, right? And the reason that I take some time to talk about that is that a lot of people don't understand that mainstream pornography nowadays is based in violence and domination and degradation. It basically embodies what I just went through. The idea that value comes from women's bodies, that women's bodies are objects that you do what you want for your own pleasure, and that women should dominate and control women and get as many of them as they possibly can. And here's a recent study that looked at the 50 top grossing mainstream pornographic films. There were 304 scenes, and you can see that aggression was rewarded 68% of the time, 11.5 acts of aggression per scene. So this is not a statement at all about the morality of showing naked bodies. In fact, Men as Peacemakers would love to see people get more creative about how they showed great sexuality. What it is it's being very clear about the fact that if our young people are getting their sex ed from pornography, which is basically what happened for me and also what happens for a lot of other young people, what they're learning is that sexuality is tied to violence and dominance towards women. It fits right into those same themes that we were just talking about in the broader society. And so in our work with the Department of Health, what they would say is they would say that the social environment is what creates these public health issues that we deal with. And they would include violence against women and trafficking as public health issues. And what somebody might say is, just because you listen to a heavy metal song that talks about murdering somebody doesn't mean that you're going to go out and murder somebody, right? That people can see these messages and not behave that way. And that's certainly true. And one of the things that the Department of Health would say in a different issue with smoking, for instance, is that if you have 1,000 people who smoke a pack a day for 30 years, and you put them on one side of the room, and then you take 1,000 people who've never smoked and you put them on the other side of the room, you're not going to get 1,000 people who have lung cancer and 1,000 people who don't have lung cancer, right? You're going to see an increased risk on that side of the room. And so the point that we're trying to portray here is that with the smoking example, it's very easy to see where the harm is coming from. There are people smoking cancer sticks, and you can tell that that's going to increase their risk. When we talk about a social environment that promotes beliefs and values that's going to be harmful to women, actually to all of us in the end, but it's very hard to see that because that environment exists from the time that you're born, and it becomes normal. And so what you have to do is take a look at how that 16-year-old boy is surrounded and enveloped in these messages around where the value of women comes from, where the value of men comes from, what relationships are, what sex is, that sort of thing, to start to get a sense that there's a toxic environment out there, and that's why you're seeing such high levels of violence against women, and that's why there's such a huge demand for the buying and selling of women and children in our country and across the world. The other thing that the Department of Health would say is that these issues are endemic. So that is that these statistics, the 1 in 3 women domestic and sexual violence, the multi-billion-dollar trafficking industries, those statistics are all going to remain the same until something in the social environment changes. And so very much our goal is to start taking a look at how we build into our community environment places that are undoing, providing alternate messaging, repairing some of the harm that's coming from the broader environment. And hopefully we can expand that more and more and more. Because realistically, we shouldn't be okay with a community environment that's celebrating the volunteer contributions of the women in our community, celebrating the top 10 kind of most volunteer-oriented girls in the society, and on the same page is advertising strip clubs that value and promote women's bodies being sold and used for other people's profit and pleasure. That should not be something as a community that we're sitting there and thinking is okay. So what we're talking about here, and I think I'm getting towards the end of my time, is primary prevention in public health terms, a systematic process that promotes healthy environments and reduces the likelihood of harm, taking action before the harm stops or starts. This is a different way of looking at that spectrum of prevention, but just like all the rest of Men as Peacemakers programming, if we're going to look at ending the demand for sex trafficking, we have to think about it on all of these levels, from doing awareness campaigns, which there's a lot of going on right now, all the way to thinking about the policy and organizational practices that exist in our community, or that could be created creatively to help maintain a more respectful and safe environment for boys and girls and men and women. This again is where Men Against Sex Trafficking comes into play. It's the same slide, but maybe you look at it a little bit differently, because you can see that the goal of Men Against Sex Trafficking over time, because this isn't going to be a short-term thing, is to get deeper and deeper and deeper into the strategic process of addressing the demand that exists. And in order to do that, we know that Men Against Sex Trafficking is one piece of the equation. We are going to implement something that is called the Mending Project to ensure goods and services for victims. Whoops. I obviously have some timing issues on this thing, but over on the table there you can see some pamphlets and brochures about the Mending Project. The Mending Project is designed to have men connect with advocacy organizations, connect with the folks who are serving victims, and find out what goods and services are needed by women who are trying to get out of trafficking. And we have done that. We have a top 10 list that you can see there on the table. And men in the community are starting to connect with businesses to collect those services, tax deductible, because they go through Men as Peacemakers. And then Men as Peacemakers is basically housing a spreadsheet of all the goods and services that are available, so that the various awesome advocacy organizations that are beginning to serve trafficking victims, including the American Indian Community Housing Organization, PAVSA, Lifehouse, Safe Haven Shelter, can all have access to those goods and services as they are needed. And this really shakes up the equation, because it's men talking to leaders in the community about addressing this harm, right? So that in and of itself starts to shake up the social norm a bit. We are also moving towards implementing local policies to reduce the sexual exploitation of women and children. There's a variety of ways to look at that. I have some information on something called a clean hotel policy, which helps create allies out of the hotel industry, trainings around how to spot trafficking victims, and policies that make it so that they don't promote and sell pay-per-view pornography or strip clubs or things like that right out of the hotel rooms. So those are some policies that help to undercut some of the money out of this situation. And then we're also going to be supporting arrest and prosecution policies for the buyers and sellers of women and children, and obviously working with a lot of local community partners in order to do that work. I'm going to skip through this so that there's time for questions. But this is just a more detailed sort of run through of the different projects that we are working on. But I did want to mention that I would encourage anyone who's interested to take some information over there to sign up for Men Against Sex Trafficking if you're interested. Our next meeting is this Thursday at 7 o'clock at Men as Peacemakers. And there's a list of 5 things that you can do whether you join or not. You can join Men Against Sex Trafficking. You can support organizations like the American Indian Community Housing Organization, PAVSA, Mending the Sacred Hoop, Lifehouse and Safe Haven Shelter. They are doing amazing work. They're actually taking leadership on the trafficking issue. An organization like Men as Peacemakers just has the ability to focus in on where the demand is coming from, but all these other organizations have to focus on what you do with the people who are experiencing this harm and how to do that well, and that's really important work. You can take a stand against any justifications for buying prostituted women and children. Don't use pornography, promote imagery and expressions of sexuality that do not reduce people to the values of their bodies. And finally, the shameless pitch, donate to Men as Peacemakers, volunteer, like us on Facebook. As I mentioned before, this work on sex trafficking through Men as Peacemakers is completely unfunded at this point. It's one of the needs that has been brought forward, and we've figured out how to move around time and money in order to get it going in hopes that we can build a sustainable effort.
I can help you pick out the people who ask